Hello everyone, a very warm welcome to our conversation today, in which we'll be discussing the value and limits of working with nature to address climate change. This is the second instalment in our series titled Oxford Net Zero, Climate in the Balance, which is running throughout Hilary term here at Oxford. And we'll get to talk to the experts in the university's new Oxford Net Zero initiative about how we transition to net zero emissions and a stable climate. My name is Steve Smith. I'm the Executive Director of Oxford Net Zero. And last week, in the opening instalment, I was joined by Professor Miles Allen, Kaya Axelson, and Professor Sam Fankhauser to find out why we need to get global emissions of CO2 down to net zero. You can find that on the YouTube channel, in the Oxford Martin School channel. And actually already in that session, there were a fair number of questions about the role of nature and nature-based solutions in getting to net zero. So I'm delighted that this week I'm joined by Professor Nathalie Seddon and Dr. Cécile Girardin. So Professor Seddon is Professor of Biodiversity in the Department of Zoology here at Oxford, and she's the founding director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative. This initiative is a really innovative and interdisciplinary program of research and also policy advice and education aimed at increasing understanding not only of the ecological effectiveness of nature-based solutions for global challenges, but also their socio-economic effectiveness. And she holds a number of advisory roles as well, notably including being appointed a friend of COP26. So Nathalie is one of 28 global experts advising the UK government as it prepares for those climate negotiations later this year. And Dr. Cécile Girardin is the Technical Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative, and also the science lead for the Oxford Biodiversity Network. She's an expert in the carbon dynamics of tropical forests, and she too has deep experience applying science to decision-making, having worked as an environmental consultant and also for the United Nations. Not only is she a great scientist, but she's also a great artist, making really beautiful pictures, often relating to the environment and her scientific work. And you can see more of that online, and it may even make an appearance during this conversation. So the way we're going to do this is Cécile and Nathalie are going to cover a few themes, and at various points I'm going to jump in with questions. I'm sure many of you will have questions too, and we really want to hear them. So to enter your question, you have to be logged into Crowdcast rather than watching via YouTube. Hopefully you'll see an Ask a Question button at the bottom right of your screen. Click on that. You can type in your question, or equally importantly, you can vote up questions that you like that are already written there. And I'll be looking at them as we go along, and I'll do my best to cover as many as possible before we finish. Finally, do be aware that we're recording this talk, so it will be available on YouTube afterwards.
Thanks for the introductions, and indeed thanks very much for the opportunity for taking part in this series of really compelling seminars over the next few weeks on the theme of net zero. And it was great to tune in last week and to have the scene so brilliantly set by my colleagues, and also to see that there was quite a bit of interest in the role of nature in this story. So it's a great honour to be here today to talk about that, and we look forward to addressing your questions perhaps as we go along. So Steve wanted us to really start out by defining nature-based solutions. So and explaining, why they're an important concept and how they differ from other what feels sometimes like a plethora of green concepts in circulation. So let me start by doing that. So put extremely simply, nature-based solutions involve working with natural and living systems to address societal challenges, providing benefits for both human well-being and biodiversity, and that's critical. So more specifically, they are actions that involve the protection, restoration, or management of natural and semi-natural habitats, so our wetlands, our forests, our kelp forests, our ancient grasslands, seagrass meadows, woodlands, and so forth. They also include the sustainable management of our aquatic systems and working lands, so our croplands and plantations, including practices such as agroforestry. And then the fourth broad category of nature-based solutions is the creation of novel ecosystems in and around cities. So by that I mainly mean green infrastructure and blue infrastructure, so freshwater infrastructure in our urban areas. So the concept of nature-based solutions is rooted in the understanding that ecosystems support human societies in multiple ways, from providing food and clean water and shelter, to storing carbon and protecting us from the impacts of extreme events such as floods, droughts, heat waves, and so forth. The concept, and this is really important to understand, that the concept also arises from the understanding that biodiversity loss and climate change share some of the main drivers, and hence they share some of the same solutions. So in particular, land use change is both the biggest driver of biodiversity declines, accounting for about 30%, according to the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services report published a couple of years ago. But it is also the second biggest source of greenhouse gases, accounting for around 23%, according to the IPCC. So in theory, at least, addressing land use change through nature-based solutions can therefore both contribute to slowing warming and arrest biodiversity declines in terrestrial systems. So why are nature-based solutions important? So I think that it's a very important concept because it really does represent a different way of looking at our relationship with nature, rather than regarding all these natural ecosystems as being really vulnerable to human activities, which of course they are, but it's also recognizing that they are, if we look after them and restore them and maintain them, they can be a major ally in the fight against global change. The concept is also very important more practically because they are, it is for the first time bringing together communities that have hitherto largely worked in isolation, those communities of researchers and practitioners working on climate change, biodiversity loss, and critically development. So on this slide, you can see in front of you is a sort of a new graphical explainer of nature-based solutions, which we hope will enhance people's understanding of what they are. And we've tried to communicate this critical idea that nature-based solutions are actions that are underpinned by the diversity of life, so by biodiversity, and they are actions that are designed and implemented with the full engagement and consent of local peoples, indigenous peoples, and so forth. So in this, when we think about nature-based solutions, we have to really think about sort of people and nature working together. So that's in the yellow band here. They work together to co-produce a variety of outcomes. This is the blue band, which benefits society. These then also in turn can feed back to nature and benefit nature and so on. So while the ultimate goal of nature-based solutions is to support sustainable development, the ecosystems that provide the nature-based solutions must themselves, of course, be healthy, functional, and biodiverse if such benefits are to be provided over the long term. Hence, to qualify as a nature-based solution, an action has to sustainably produce one or more benefits for people, such as reducing flood risk and/or storing carbon, whilst causing no net loss to biodiversity compared to the state of the landscape prior to the intervention. So what does this look like in practice? Well, through the talk, we'll be referring to various examples, but if you turn the next slide, please. These are some examples of good, robust nature-based solutions, just to give you very briefly an idea of what can be involved. So cocoa agroforestry, a project in Sierra Leone, which is much more profitable, and improves local livelihoods. But through avoided deforestation, this particular project is protecting biodiversity and saving around 500,000 tons of carbon a year. You've got urban forests. This is an example from Wisconsin in the USA, but urban forests are being established all over the world now. And there is evidence or growing evidence that increasing tree cover in parks or on pavements and so forth can significantly reduce daily temperatures during heat waves, whilst also increasing carbon sequestration and, of course, providing multiple physical and mental and health benefits to people. And then another example would be a community wetland restoration and protected area project in the Peruvian Andes. This is increasing carbon storage, improving water supplies, whilst also reducing erosion and landslides and providing improved habitat for wild species such as the charismatic vicuña. And interestingly, with this project, which makes it a very good nature-based solution, is that improved water regulation is reviving natural pastures, meaning livestock herds are healthier, and local people have more reliable sources of income. So that's some examples. Thank you. Next slide. Next slide, please. Great.
Thanks very much, Natalie, and sorry for leaving you in the lurch there. Ironically, with snow on the ground outside, my laptop managed to overheat running all these things. So hopefully that won't happen again, but if it does and I disappear, just carry on without me. So that's the definition of nature-based solutions that we're using. Obviously, for Oxford Net Zero, we're primarily interested in drawing down carbon, both reducing emissions and enhancing carbon storage to get that balance of sources and sinks. So, Cecile, what's the actual potential of nature-based solutions to help us achieve this goal?
Thanks. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so I'd start by saying that we have a good understanding of how much nature-based solutions contribute in terms of avoided emissions and enhanced sinks. We can start going to the next slide. But there's still confusion around this, as it's been estimated over a range of timeframes with different model assumptions and different objectives. So there are a number of papers out there that have come out in recent years addressing this issue. But recently we've been working on a model that addresses this question directly by repositioning the mitigation potential of nature-based solutions in a context that's relevant to the Paris Agreement, the big question. How much could nature-based solutions contribute to limiting peak warming to well below 2 degrees this century, whilst pursuing efforts to limiting warming to 1.5? So looking at it in terms of peak warming. Next slide, please. So first, we take the latest estimates from a model presented in Bronson Griscom et al.'s team from papers that are published in 2017 and 2020. This is a model that's widely recognized as being a robust model that estimating the cost-effective climate change mitigation from nature-based solutions on land. It's important to recognize here that we're not looking at NBS in oceans. And again, it's important to recognize that we're looking at cost-effective mitigation. So at cost of less than $100 per megagram CO2 equivalent, we get to a total avoided emissions and enhanced sink of 10 gigatons CO2 per year, approximately. And this it comes from several pathways. So avoided emissions essentially come from protecting intact lands, protecting our ecosystems, our forests, our wetlands, grasslands, and that adds up to about 4 gigatons CO2 per year. And then enhanced sinks, most of that comes from better management of working lands, and some also comes from restoring native covers. So next slide, please. And here it's important to know that how much land would we need to achieve these targets? So not as much as you might initially think, because 40% of this comes from protecting existing ecosystems, so we don't need more land for that. 40% comes from better management of existing lands. These are lands we are already using to produce food, fiber, and it would entail improving our management of these lands in ways that are more aligned with our goals for biodiversity and climate. And 20% only comes from restoring ecosystems. So there's been a lot of enthusiasm around restoring ecosystems, which is brilliant. But in terms of mitigating climate change, you can see here that only 2 gigatons of CO2 per year out of the 10 gigatons we're estimating comes from restoring ecosystems. So the take-home message here is that in most countries, the majority of nature-based solutions mitigation comes from protecting and better management of working lands. Next slide, please. And these estimates always must come well constrained. So there are some constraints that are incorporated in these models. So for example, biodiversity safeguards. We make sure we restore forest ecosystems in areas that are ecologically appropriate for forest. We're not replacing a perfectly well-functioning savanna with a forest, for example. We exclude boreal biomes due to the albedo effect. We take into consideration the saturation of ecosystem carbon sequestration rates over time. As forests mature, they will saturate. We take into account food security, fiber security, and again, the sensitivity to cost. So when citing this estimate of 10 gigatons CO2 per year, or which is also, when you extend that to other greenhouse gases, you get to 11 gigatons of CO2 equivalent of CO2 per year equivalent. Always cite this with the sensitivity to cost. This is at a cost of under $100 per megagram CO2 equivalent. If we increase the cost, we will increase this potential. But as these estimates don't currently account for the complexities of governance issues, so we need to remember and take into account land rights, the conflicts between land ownership and management, the local inequalities, the local governance tensions. And there's a lack of information about the role of marine ecosystems, and we need to also include the impact of climate change on the biosphere in these estimates. Next slide, please. So based on these estimates, we can go to the next slide. Based on these estimates, there's been a powerful statement in the discussion, in the global discussions. Nature represents 30% of the solution. And it's found its way into the IPCC and the draft text of the Convention on Biological Diversity. But this statement in itself is problematic because it does not specify that the 11 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year is a cost-constrained estimate. In general, when we talk about this, we need to, again, I'm stressing this several times, but it is important because the estimate is sensitive to cost. And when we talk about the solution, what is the solution? There are a number of mitigation pathways that are considered in the IPCC model. So this is a very vague and general statement that doesn't necessarily reflect the potential mitigation of nature-based solutions to climate change. If we look at it in terms of proportions, compared to 2019 emissions, we get to almost 30%, but this is still problematic because it depends on the base year you're looking at. And as we know, percentages can be manipulated easily. So there is still confusion around the contribution of nature-based solutions for climate mitigation. And this is where we try to answer this question in a context relevant to the Paris Agreement. How can the deployment of NBS help limit peak warming to well below 2 degrees C this century while pursuing efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees C? So next slide. So we took the simple models presented in the IPCC Special Report 1.5, and we added the results from Griscom et al.'s model that I showed you just now. And here, these are the results. So if you look at focus on the gray and purple lines in the foreground, you will see that the solid lines are the model results you find in the IPCC Special Report 1.5. And the dotted lines are the same scenario with contributions from nature-based solutions. So the 10 gigaton CO2 per year that I was showing before. So you can see that the contribution of natural climate solutions is very time sensitive. By the time we reach peak in 2055, so look at the solid gray line, this one peaks in 2055 at 1.5 degrees C. And if you look at the dotted line, you can see that there is a avoided in peak warming by about 0.1 degrees C by deploying nature-based solutions at scale. So it's a significant contribution, but not as much as later in the century. Next slide, please. So the results we see here is that nature-based solutions have a key role to play in mitigating climate change. And NBS can help meet the immediate net zero pathways. They're technology-ready, cost-effective solutions that make a significant contribution to tackling net emissions by mid-century. But there's another key point in this analysis, is that they keep on acting well after the peak in global warming. And if you look at up to 2100, you can see the increase in contribution if you follow the dotted line. So in both scenarios, in the gray scenarios, which is 1.5 degree path, peaking at 1.5 degree, and in the purple scenario, which is peaking at 2 degree around 2080. So the contribution of nature-based solutions to limiting peak warming is time sensitive, meaning that we need to deploy nature-based solutions now to maximize their mitigation benefit later. And the relative contribution of NBS depends on the ambition of the scenario. In more ambitious scenario, like the 1.5 degree scenario, we get less of an effect because there's less time for nature-based solutions to act, even if we start implementing them, deploying them on a large scale now. In a less ambitious scenario, which is a 2 degree scenario, by the time we reach peak warming around 2080, they will have more time to act. So there's also a question of intergenerational equity here. Other negative emissions technologies put the burden of cost and implementation on future generations, but NBS requires a significant investment now and will remain beneficial for generations to come. Next slide, please. You can go to the next slide. So we need to recognize that, however, their capacity is finite. There are limits to how much the biosphere can hold whilst meeting other land needs. We need to talk about permanence when we consider the contribution of nature-based solutions to mitigation. We know that properly protected and carefully managed ecosystems such as intact peatlands and old-growth tropical forests are likely to continue to store carbon for thousands of years. And they're more resilient in the face of extreme climate change and of pathogens or even fire. So hence the importance of prioritizing the protection of intact ecosystems. Nonetheless, nature-based solutions inevitably present some risk of reversal in terms whether political or biophysical. And also, when we look at the potential of nature-based solutions to mitigate climate change, we need to stress that they cannot provide these benefits if we go beyond 1.5 peak warming. So the potential can only be achieved in tandem with the decarbonization of the global economy at unprecedented rates. They go hand in hand, of course. So
Cecile, we've had a number of questions coming in. I wonder, some of them touch on what you've been talking about on potential. So perhaps I could leap in and ask a couple and get your brief answers on them. Hannah asks, is it possible that rewilding and restoring the soil could have a more significant and positive impact than planting trees? I think that speaks to one of your earlier slides. And if I understood it correctly, you're suggesting that restoration of these habitats and what we might call rewilding has a role to play, but it's perhaps smaller in potential. And also Nick Holtzberg asks, how reliable is the measurement and calculation of how much carbon can be captured with some of these solutions? So are there some key uncertainties involved?
Yes. So in terms of the uncertainties, there are key uncertainties, of course. We do have a very good understanding of the global carbon dynamics of these ecosystems. Thorough understanding, been studying this for decades, and we understand the uncertainties, and those are modeled in the models we present. But I think it's fair to say we have a robust understanding of how the carbon dynamics of these ecosystems work. And in terms of looking at a range of protection of different ecosystems, not just tree planting, we'll be addressing this as we continue the discussion, but this is one of the key points, and I think Nathalie will talk about this a lot. We can't just focus on trees. Trees in themselves are not an ecosystem. A resilient ecosystem is an intact ecosystem that is composed of biodiversity and a range of trophic levels, and it's the whole system that is resilient to climate change or pest attack or fire. And similarly, we can't just focus on forests. We have peatlands, grasslands, tundras, savannas, all these ecosystems, coral reefs. We can keep on going. All these ecosystems are very important to the health of our planet.
So Natalie, I mean, we've been talking about carbon, but we're already talking about the complexities and the other varied things that nature-based solutions do. And of course, they're quite popular because they don't just do carbon, they do a lot of other things. So what are the other reasons for viewing nature-based solutions as having advantages?
Well, I think the whole idea of nature-based solutions is that they have the potential to bring these multiple benefits and to support, a very wide range of ecosystem services beyond carbon. And the risk is, as we'll talk about, that if you just focus on the carbon, these other benefits, and then, implement on that basis, these other benefits tend to be sacrificed, or it trades off against them. We can explore why. So, nature-based solutions, the concept actually emerged and developed within the context of adaptation to the impacts of climate change, particularly in the global south. I think we've got another, could you move the slide on to the next slide, please? Yeah. So, in particular, there's a growing evidence base. Can people see that? Yes. Okay. It's in focus now. Particularly strong evidence building that the working with nature is very important in terms of reducing exposure to the impacts of climate change. Example particularly widely acknowledged is that restoring and protecting coastal ecosystems such as our kelp and seagrass, salt marshes, coral and oyster reefs can help defend against coastal flooding, erosion, storm surges, and in some cases it works best if combined with engineered approaches if the severity or intensity of the threat is very, very high. Meanwhile, there's also evidence growing all the time that the restoration and protection of habitats of wetlands and of forests within catchment areas can improve different aspects of water security, whilst also reducing flood risk and soil erosion and landslides. And then, of course, nature-based agriculture, in particular practices such as agroforestry or floating gardens, that these approaches can increase the resilience of food supplies in the face of new pests, diseases and climate extremes. While in the urban environment, we know with increasing certainty that different sorts of nature-based solutions, green spaces, green roofs, green walls and so forth, can really play a key role in mitigating flood risk and also cooling during heat waves. But reducing exposure is actually only one of three distinct ways in which nature-based solutions can support human adaptation to climate change. So if you turn to the next slide, I clarify what these three pathways are. And it's in fact the sort of the second and the third pathways that generally tend to be overlooked. So we've talked about reducing exposure, but nature-based solutions can reduce the degree to which communities or individuals and societies are actually affected by the climate change impacts that they experience. This is sometimes called their social sensitivity. And implementation of nature-based solutions can also, via a third route, build adaptive capacity, and build social capital and preparedness for future changes and shocks. So if we go to the next slide, just to give some examples about what I mean by these two other pathways. So, nature-based solutions in many contexts can secure a wide range of benefits that secure diverse sources of food and income, and these can provide a degree of financial and nutritional security when usual sources of income or crops fail in the face of climate extremes. And this is really important, particularly, everywhere in the world, but perhaps especially in the global south, where there is a high dependency on local natural resources for food and income. And so here we have an example in Vanuatu, where marine protected areas can act as a reservoir of resources that can be temporarily open to fishing as a source of food and income for the local communities when their sort of land-based livelihoods, for example, one based around rice, in this case, are reduced or limited due to the effects of things like El Nino, then the droughts that El Nino causes. And the next slide, please. And so the third pathway around building adaptive capacities, this is about building the capacity of local communities to deal with future stresses. And this is sort of the actual process of implementation, of designing and managing, of being involved in and having agency in nature-based solutions, giving local people leadership roles, supporting them to cover their own researches. This can all strengthen their ability to future climate hazards. So, for example, community-based mangrove restorations, as an example from the Philippines, has been shown to really help build social cohesion, to empower women by providing them with natural resource management training. And of course, they also have a lot of their own knowledge that they can deploy, and increasing participation in creating adaptation strategies. And this is building in this area and in other parts of the world as well. This is building, you know, social capital, and increasing social ties, increasing the flow of knowledge, and is actually causing projects to sort of scale out as well as scale up in this context. And this can can feed back into the improved and sustained stewardship of the ecosystem, and thereby secure, you know, over the long term, a continued supply of nature's benefits. But of course, these sort of nature-based approaches to dealing with adaptation via these different pathways can be fairly low risk and also fairly low cost. So I've just got a couple of slides to talk a bit about the economic benefits. If we can change the slide now, please. So, you know, nature-based solutions can really be very cost-effective, and there are some, you know, key examples here of where, you know, the implementation of nature-based solution has a significant role in reducing the damages caused by flooding and so forth. So benefits of mangrove restoration, which include particularly disaster risk reduction, but also fisheries and recreation, have been calculated as around, you know, up to 10 times the costs. Meanwhile, nature-based coastal defence projects are up to 5 times more cost-effective compared to engineered structures. And a global analysis showed that, you know, if we were to lose our coral reefs globally, the annual damages from flooding would double and costs from storms would triple. So this is very sort of important and compelling, and obviously very, very important and of great interest to the insurance sector. Next slide. But perhaps sort of most relevant, at least in the near term, given that we're in a global pandemic and this is having horrendous impacts on the economies of all the world's countries, you know, there is also growing evidence that, you know, nature-based solutions can support short-term economic recovery. So, for example, for every $1 million invested in coastal habitat restoration in the US, 40 new jobs are created. And this critically compares to 19 for investment in aviation, 7 for finance, and interestingly, only 5 for oil and gas. And then the Food and Land Use Coalition produced an analysis last year, and which indicated that investment of around $350 billion in sustainable land use systems, sustainable food production, could create more than 120 million new jobs. And the next slide. In the middle of last year, the World Economic Forum also did publish some analyses in their new Nature Economy report, in which they estimated that if we were to prioritize nature-based solutions in COVID recovery strategies, this had the potential to generate a staggering 400 million jobs and generate about $10 trillion per year globally. And the key aspects of this strategy would be ending the damaging agricultural subsidies and replacing them with sustainable farming practices, ending perverse fishing subsidies and replacing that with, again, subsidizing better management of wild fish and so forth. So there are all these different things that we can do that effectively amount to restoring and protecting and working with natural ecosystems and can quickly generate jobs and thereby support economic recovery in multiple ways. So next slide, please. So as a result of, you know, all this growing evidence and awareness of the potential of nature-based solutions to bring all these multiple benefits and to bind and unite multilateral agreements and support economic recovery, nature-based solutions, as many of you tuning into this will be aware, of a huge amount of traction in business and government. Over the last couple of years, we've seen dozens of pledges and new funding streams for nature-based solution being announced by countries and companies. I mean, there's too many of them to list them. Some key ones mentioned here on the slide. But in late 2020, quite importantly, the Leaders Pledge for Nature was launched at the first United Nations Summit on Biodiversity. And this pledge, which has been spearheaded by the UK government, has so far been signed by 83 nations. And all of these nations have committed to cooperating and holding one another to account in their joint mission to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. Now, these commitments are obviously very encouraging and may represent a significant shift in the zeitgeist of business and government, but we worry that few of these commitments define clear plans and actions and methods for verifying commitments. And as we'll go on to talk about, although well-designed nature-based solutions, as we've explained, can deliver multiple benefits for people and nature, so much of the recent limelight has been very narrowly focused on their role in mitigation, and particularly focused on tree planting as though it was some sort of silver bullet solution to climate change. Next slide. So yeah, this is just a slide with some examples of investments in so-called nature-based solutions that, whilst very important, nonetheless, are focusing on tree planting rather than nature-based solutions more broadly.
Thanks, Natalie. So we're having a number of questions actually asking about some of these, digging into these trade-offs and issues, because obviously it's quite easy and potentially perhaps naive to say, there are multiple wins, this is good for a whole load of reasons, there are no downsides, so we should be cracking on with all of this. But I think you're alluding to the fact that there might actually be some risks. And Mike Jones actually asks, for instance, how do we get beyond the rhetoric of simple win-wins when there are actually some tricky trade-offs at multiple scales and across different aims? Mm-hmm. So I think we're sort of working our way towards that. I think that's what we'll move to focus on. So Cecile, maybe you can talk to us a bit about where some of those tricky trade-offs lie, and perhaps there's an imbalance in incentives at the moment.
Yes, thank you, Steve. There are potential pitfalls of focusing on nature-based solutions, in particular focusing on nature-based solutions as a mitigation option. So this focus on rapid carbon sequestration as the metric of success for nature-based solutions activities, for example, raises serious moral hazards. So there's an issue that investing in nature-based solutions for carbon offsets is distracting from the need for a rapid phase out of fossil fuels. So the carbon offset market is booming, and many organizations are currently relying on nature-based solutions as a means to offset fossil fuel carbon use, and plan to do so for some time yet. And removing fossilized carbon reserves and placing them in the biosphere is potentially dangerous and potentially not aligned with our net zero targets, or at the moment, the way the voluntary market is designed, they are not aligned with our net zero targets. So ultimately, we caution against focusing on carbon as the main metric of success for nature-based solutions activities, because this can pose a threat to biodiversity, to human rights, and to the climate. So this overemphasis on tree planting for rapid carbon gain rather than a wide range of nature-based solutions, for example, has adverse impacts on local communities and on biodiversity. Next slide, please. So the carbon market is booming, and we have fossil fuel companies, airlines, big fossil emitters, touting carbon offsets from nature-based solutions, which sometimes appear as a way of delaying the urgent decarbonization of those sectors. So there's a danger that the current direction and balance of attention that's playing for nature-based solutions is encouraging these oil and gas and airlines and other heavy emitters who may be enthusiastic about buying very cheap credits as an excuse to perpetuate business as usual emissions. And then with this is a quote from Vivid Economics Investor Guide to Negative Emissions Technology that specifically advised that within negative emission technologies, nature-based solutions focused on reforestation and afforestation are the most viable near-term opportunity and could generate more than 800 billion in annual revenue. So I will I think, next slide, please. I will remind you that only 20% of the mitigation from NBS on land comes from restoring forests. On this note, I think, next slide, please. I will let Nathalie give some specific examples.
Great. Yes. So we've sort of alluded to some of the problems. There is a big emphasis on tree planting, and in certain parts of the world with certain schemes, this is having adverse impacts on local communities and in adverse impacts on biodiversity. Can we have the next slide, please? So just to sort of, there is a big problem on this focus on tree planting, particularly afforestation. And by afforestation, we mean tree planting in naturally treeless ecosystems. So habitats that naturally do not support trees are often targeted by big commercial tree planting afforestation programs. And often these plantation programs can involve exotic or non-native species. And this is problematic. So we've said it's problematic because of the point about it distracting from the need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. It's also problematic framing commercial forestry operations, low diversity forestry operations with short rotation times, framing those as the climate solution is extremely misleading, because they only offer, well, plantations are an important source of fuel and wood and so forth, and paper products. We obviously need plantations in the right places, but they're not a climate solution because they only offer very short-term, high-risk carbon stores. Much harvested wood is for very short-lived products, and also these plantations, as I say, tend to involve low diversity, non-native species, and that lack of diversity means they're much more vulnerable to the impacts of pests and climate extremes. And that's been really very clearly demonstrated experimentally, empirically now. And crucially important is that they also distract from the urgent need to protect intact ecosystems, incredibly important for biodiversity, for adaptation, and for mitigation as well. And they can often threaten other critically important habitats if those habitats are replaced by low diversity tree plantations, so peatlands and grasslands, areas that are actually naturally quite rich in carbon above ground and in the soil, naturally rich in biodiversity. And these natural forests can be replaced by, or natural ecosystems can be replaced by plantations, leading to a net loss of biodiversity and carbon. And on the next slide, we've got two sort of key examples of this that really illustrate the problem that we face with the way commercial plantations are being rolled out in some parts of the world. We have a 34,000 hectare concession, which was established in lowland tropical forest in Cambodia in the name of climate change. This rich, diverse ecosystem, carbon rich, full of species, was replaced by an acacia monoculture. Local communities were dispossessed from the land, and obviously there's a net loss of carbon and biodiversity. Another part of the world, in Chile, government subsidized plantation forests doubled in their extent. Their carbon stores only increased by 2%. Meanwhile, the native, biodiverse, carbon-rich Nothofagus forest shrunk by 13%. So in other words, this is an example where government subsidies, again, kind of in the name of climate change, accelerated biodiversity loss. So it's a problem for carbon, it's a problem for biodiversity, and it really is a problem for people. I mean, good nature-based solutions are with, by, and for Indigenous people and local communities. It's often their land, they have resource rights and cultural rights, and often rich knowledge, which can be ignored in these schemes. Their rollout can often result in the loss of livelihoods, and the projects are rejected, they're not sustainable, and they're definitely not ethical. So we really need to avoid these issues. Next slide, please.
So, I mean, Natalie, this is a really hot topic at the moment. I know, for instance, Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of England, is chairing a task force on scaling of voluntary carbon offsetting markets. So what's the solution here? We've also got a few questioners who share these concerns about the role of nature-based solutions in carbon offsetting. If you're saying that there are potential problems or real problems with the use of these measures and large-scale tree planting as a carbon offsetting and a high risk of greenwashing, what's the answer? Is it to avoid, eliminate these from all carbon offsetting schemes? Is it using some other kind of mechanism, or not even allowing any form of financial transfer to scale these up? Or does that, risk that we don't actually achieve any of these things that require finance? So what's the way forward here?
Well, I think we need to be thinking about, identifying good investors and making sure that we link those good investors with good projects, and developing boundary organizations that could do that role to channel good investment to the right sorts of projects. And so there's a question about good investments, which I think Cecile will reflect on in a short while, but we can do a lot of work, and are already doing a lot of work, in identifying what good looks like, because as nations and businesses begin to incorporate nature-based nature-based solutions in their strategies. And we need to have some sort of consensus about successful, sustainable nature-based solutions, and so to this end, the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative worked a year ago, actually it was now, with a large consortium of UK-based conservation and development organisations and research institutes to develop some four high-level guidelines on what good looks like, basically, that avoids the pitfalls that we've described. And we sent these guidelines in a letter to the president of the upcoming COP26, so that Alok Sharma. Now, these guidelines focus on policy guardrails for the uptake of the concept in international climate policy, but they complement several other normative principles that have been developed by many of my very experienced colleagues in different organisations across the world. So if we go to the next slide, some of those frameworks and guidelines and principles for successful sustainable nature-based solutions are listed here. The World Bank principles on nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, for example, the WWF principles, and very importantly, the last year, IUCN released the global standard for nature-based solutions. These different sets of principles are converging on a set of ideas about what we need to look for when it comes to investing in nature-based solutions. So if we look at the next slide, we can see that the first guideline is to emphasize what we've stressed in this presentation, that nature-based solutions are an important part of the climate solution, but are not a substitute for rapid phase-out of fossil fuels, and must not, under any circumstances, delay action to decarbonize our economies. So any funding for nature-based solutions, if it comes from offsetting, must only really come from those entities with credible, verifiable, ambitious net zero plans, and that's critically important. And then you have the other three guidelines, which we've also emphasised in this discussion, that nature-based solutions need to involve the protection and restoration of a wide range of naturally occurring intact ecosystems on land and in the sea, so not just forests, and improve management of working lands and seas globally. So we need to be thinking about connecting and restoring a diversity of ecosystems and habitats in our landscapes. The third guideline, critically important, are implemented. Nature-based solutions can only be successful and sustainable and ethical if they're implemented with the full consent and engagement of local communities, including farmers, women, indigenous peoples. And fourthly, and very fundamentally, nature-based solutions need to sustain or enhance the diversity of native species and habitats. So single species plantations, as we've emphasised, are crops. Are useful crops in some contexts, but they're not a nature-based solutions. But when it comes to, so if we go to the next slide, there are some examples of what good looks like. And actually, there's a lot of great work going on in the UK. And actually, over the next 12 months, we hope to be showcasing this. There's a lot of really, really great projects that are being, three of which are shown in the slide here, which are being led by local communities, which are looking at multiple benefits that provide alternative incomes to farmers and other stakeholders in the landscape, and that have a kind of a really long-term vision that tries to manage and balance the trade-offs between all these different benefits of working with nature. So I think, and there's that sort of availability of projects to talk about is just growing all the time, and many more projects are being implemented that are actually following at least the second, third and fourth guideline. When it comes to the first guideline, this is a little bit more complex, so to pass over to Cecile to talk about that one.
Yeah, so this is the one about it not being a substitute for phasing out fossil fuels, is that
exactly
right?
And the need, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. So thanks. So it's clear that we urgently need to increase the flow of investment towards nature-based solutions projects, towards nature, and nature has a significant contribution to make to global emissions reductions. I'd say to achieve this, we need to reassess the way investors measure the success of NBS activities, as Nathalie said, and starting with focusing on avoiding, minimizing, reducing emissions before offsetting. So adhering to the mitigation hierarchy framework in general. And the use of offsetting of remaining emissions with NBS activities will need to meet the four high-level principles Nathalie was describing, as well as the Oxford principles for net zero aligned carbon offsettings, which call for high quality offsets. These net zero emissions, it's a specific claim whose credibility needs to be defended. And we acknowledge that at the moment, many carbon offsets on the market do not adhere to the standards that provide this level of certainty for eliminating fossil fuel emissions. And in the long term, we recognize that there's a need to move to geological storage over the long term, so by mid-century, focus on nature-based solutions as a negative emission technology now, because they're available, they're technologically available and cost-effective, and they will provide mitigation benefits up to the end of the century. But we will need to move to geological storage in the longer term. So here are a few key take-home messages about what we were talking on nature-based solutions in net zero, the race to net zero. Nature-based solutions make a vital contribution to cooling this century, with the potential to reduce peak warming up to 0.3 degrees by 2075 in a 2°C scenario. That was the model results I was showing before. But this can only be achieved in tandem with decarbonizing the economy, as otherwise warming will turn ecosystems into net sources of CO2. Nature-based solutions may be financed in the short term through offsetting schemes, although we do need to recognize that there are a variety of financing mechanisms to increase the flow of investment to the right projects. There's public financing, risk management, blended finances to jumpstart the nature-based solutions market. These are only a few of the financing options described in Mark Carney's recent report on financing for climate. The Global Canopy project also published a good booklet on financing mechanisms for nature-based, for biodiversity. And it includes shifting to sustainable supply chains. For example, the World Economic Forum is recognizing that this is a big potential. Philanthropy and conservation, and in general, green financial products. So green bonds, green lending, green equity, transitioning our financing mechanisms from finance that damages climate and nature to finance that is nature positive and net zero aligned. So in the long terms, we see that the project in which investors will invest will meet the guidelines for good, sustainable, ethical, nature-based solutions. And by mid-century, negative emissions technologies need to have shifted away from biological stores to carbon removal in low-risk permanent geological storage. And we anticipate that in the medium term, the flow of finance will come from the carbon market, but in the longer term, it will shift to these different funding mechanisms. And critically, we need to invest in nature-based solutions now for the multiple benefit they bring in terms of mitigation and adaptation, biodiversity loss, preventing biodiversity loss, and human well-being.
Thank you very much, Cecile and Nathalie. We've had loads of questions come in, and I'm going to close in a few minutes by just asking you your thoughts on the kind of key milestones and decision points coming up, because we have not only COP26, but a variety of other really big international milestones coming up. But I'm going to try and spin through as many of the slightly more sort of technical and specific questions as we got, and I'd appreciate as brief and pithy answers as you can provide, and we'll see how many we can get through. So I'll share with you a couple. One of them from Mike Jones says, in his view, one of the constraints on nature-based solutions and the success of them is the use of deterministic methods, such as log frames and theory of change. And we won't overcome these constraints until funders are willing to accept the need for more flexible designs based on future analysis and being more responsive to unexpected events and trends. So he asked, how do we encourage funders to take that into account? Is that a framing you agree with? And if so, how do we take a more adaptive approach? I'll just also ask on behalf of Ollie Tapper. He says, there seems to be an increasing consensus that whales have a major role to play as a natural climate solution. So do you expect that to gain more attention as a nature-based solution in the next few years? So who wants to go first on tackling one or the other of those?
I can tackle the whales one to let Nathalie think about the first one. So whales, we mean as in the animal.
Yes.
Right? Yes.
Yeah, not the country.
So megafauna in general, yes, have a big role to play in terms of nature-based solutions. They, in terms of mitigation, there's a lot of research around the impact they have on carbon dynamics and nutrient cycling, but also in terms of adaptation at the local level. So yes, they do certainly have a big role to play. And there's a lot of research coming out on this at the moment, from Oxford University notably, and we'll see a lot more about this.
To answer particularly concisely, I mean, I think Cecile did a good job in highlighting that, the need for blended finance, the need for lots of different, financial mechanisms that potentially change over time as well, and emphasising that flexibility and adaptive management of ecosystems, as well as financial investments in those, it is needed. I think what the private sector is becoming increasingly aware of and engaging with, captured in a number of some fairly major publications over the last 12 months, is that the risk that not just climate change, but climate change combined with biodiversity loss, or the loss and damage to our ecosystems, the financial risks that places companies under. And this is, I would say, a major, it's having a very galvanizing effect in the private sector to think more in terms of how we release very big and long-term sources of finance. But things are, yeah. I mean, the thing about nature-based solutions is they are very much place-based, and their effectiveness in terms of meeting societal changes and providing these different services does change over time. And I think funders need to do a lot of work in trying to explain that clearly to those interested in investing, that they might not get the return on investment that they want immediately, but then they have to be thinking ethically in terms of a more long-term plan.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you two other ones quickly. One asked by Shanmuga Sundara Bharathi is logging, i.e. cutting and using trees for building and furniture, etc., a nature-based solution? Now, I guess we'd say outright logging isn't, but I just asked that as a question about, I think, sort of forest management and ecosystem management is in there. So is there a role for sort of sustainable and positive use for working livelihoods of these forests, and what does that look like? And also another question just from Sally Richardson, perhaps you can help her out. She says she's researching the contribution of soil regeneration to carbon sequestration, and she's finding limited studies of the manpower that's needed and the land ownership issues. So do you have any suggestions for her on that? Who would like to go first on either of those two questions?
I could maybe take the first one, although Cecile, by all means, embellish my brief comments on that. Yes, sustainable management of working lands, which includes, forestry, is a very important part of all this. Clearly, we recognise that that's a source of vital livelihoods, and if done well, if evidence-based, if then those activities can enhance both carbon sequestration and provide adaptation benefits as well. But it's all, a lot of the devil, of course, is in the detail with how you do management, and we're having to, in a rapidly warming world, what good forestry, what sustainable forestry looks like is changing, and so we have to be very adaptive in how we relate to and how we use those resources. But clearly, as that graphic that Cecile showed earlier, it's an important, what goes on in those working lands has a profoundly important impact on carbon sequestration, and then, as I argued, that also is important for adaptation.
No, agreed, exactly. And in terms of soil carbon sequestration, I think that was the second question in particular. I would look to the work of Professor Pete Smith, who's done a lot of work around agricultural systems, and in particular focus on soil carbon sequestration.
Thank you. Now, very quickly, the question I warned you about, we have COP26 coming up and other things. So what are the key milestones over the next 12 months? And given that you are, working very closely with decision makers at a range of levels, what are you going to be telling them and looking for?
Yeah, I mean, the upcoming global biodiversity and climate summits this year are obviously a massive opportunity, ideally to catalyse what we really need, which is a transformative change in the way our economies run and so forth. But it's also really, really important that that policymakers and practitioners, consider the impacts on biodiversity of interventions to address climate change and vice versa. In other words, that nature-based solutions is in climate policy, is in biodiversity policy, but it's in there in a way that's aligned. So the targets for nature-based solutions are aligned across these different policy processes. In particular, UNFCCC, the Convention of Biological Diversity, the Convention to Combat Desertification, and also the Sustainable Development Goals. So we need to see, I think this year, we need to see agreement around evidence-based targets for nature-based solutions in the nationally determined contributions of Paris Agreement signatories, both basically the harmonised action for mitigation and adaptation without compromising biodiversity goals. And we've talked about what that actually might look like in practice. And we also need to see targets in the post-2020 biodiversity framework that take climate outcomes into account. And this greater collaboration between the communities of researchers that work on these different challenges, so between the IPCC and IPBES, would really, really help with this. So that's one thing I want to flag. When it comes to COP26 specifically, this is a major opportunity for the UK to get its own house in order in terms of nature-based solution in order to inspire good practice globally. So to scale up funding in good nature-based solutions, peatland restoration being a particularly important one, and the connection of ecosystems such as through the Nature Recovery Network scheme, and movements around replacing harmful agricultural subsidies that harm our environments to those that support stewardship, for example, through the ELM scheme. Those are the things I'd like to highlight in brief, but there are other things, aren't there, Cecile? There's Article 6, which we should probably talk about.
Yes. So Article 6 is the thorny issue to resolve at COP26. I think it deserves a special mention. This article establishes a new mechanism to contribute to the mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and support sustainable development. So the principle is that countries can help each other achieve their targets. So the modalities of this could strengthen the Paris Agreement, or could undermine the integrity of the Paris Agreement completely. So this is a very critical issue to resolve at COP26. The negotiations, they provide an opportunity to lay the foundations for the modalities for a robust monitoring, reporting, and verification methodology for national reporting systems that will then also influence the voluntary markets. So what we were talking about carbon offsets being poorly regulated on the voluntary market. The decisions made from COP26 on the MRV, monitoring, reporting, verification methodologies, will lay the foundations for that. So we need to ensure that they ensure additionality and permanence, that they avoid double counting, avoid leakage, set the metrics that ensure high biodiversity and also maximize human well-being. So this is the framework we're aiming for Article 6. And as Nathalie says, it also presents an opportunity to harmonize the goals of the UNFCCC and of the CBD and the metrics we use to monitor these projects.
So plenty to do, but also plenty of opportunities to have not just a net zero carbon world, but also a more biodiverse and more resilient planet as well. Yeah. We have to leave it there. I'm very sorry I couldn't ask everyone's questions, but thank you very much to you, Professor Nathalie Seddon and Dr. Cecile Girardin, and thank you to all of you joining us online. I hope you enjoyed that and found that useful, and you learned something new. Do join us again next week. Next Monday, I'll be discussing zero carbon energy systems with Professor Nick Eyre. So you can find more details and sign up on the Oxford Martin School website. And in the meantime, have a very good week.